Right, we're into the final session now, so we're just going to have around 20 minutes or so till 4 o'clock for John and I, just to wrap up. If there's any questions or comments from the audience, we'll take those as well, that are general. But I thought I'd start. I've just jotted down some words that today has really meant to me. And I guess the first thing I'd say is global. It's been absolutely fantastic to hear today about all of the different identity systems. One thing when we started this project, if you remember, John, we said we were going to convene a group, and we'll talk about the interest group in a moment that many of you are part of. But we're really going to try to bring together a conversation to address this fundamentally important issue. And today was really testament to that because we've had speakers in the room from Brazil. We've had people online from around the world. One of the names you'll have seen was Daniel Backenheimer. So Dan is very active in the interest group and the biometrics. After our keynote, talking also about biometrics. He sits on working groups and standards. But we've had people travel over from Italy. And that's really good that people are traveling to the conference at Italy, not speaking at the conference. And that's one thing, we were very competitive in who could speak. And it's not that there weren't great submissions, but we had to put together a program that covered the areas that we wanted. So some very good submissions weren't accepted for presentation. But people coming just to be part of the conversation. And Luca's unfortunately had to go and get his flight. Actually, was one of the people that you kept seeing putting questions up, so really engaging with it. And he could have done that from home, but it's really good to be here in person with you. But thanks to those that are joining online and have contributed so much as well. Yeah, we've had people talking about India, about Aadhaar and MOSIP. We've had poster presentations from Chile, people in Ghana. And we've heard just in one of the later sessions about digital identity in South Korea. So it's really been global. So that's the big word that came out for me. And I think it did say somewhere, didn't it? International conference, I think, when we've on our first slide. And it really has been truly international. So thank you all for that. John, I've got a few of some of the keywords around here that really jumped out at me today. I don't know if you want to speak about some. I'll start with one that was interesting, because we've had a few times where we talked about decentralized. And it is interesting, and Tim's talk about decentralization talks about what decentralization offers you. And it offers you lots of things, but decentralization isn't even then just a single version of that. There's different ways we can have centralized and decentralized systems. Of course, many governments will want centralized systems because they want all of the data and want to see everything. But with techniques such as privacy-enhancing technologies, we are managing to get some information or knowledge without sharing all of the data. So we're seeing some real move, and decentralization was something that really picked up to me, and that include the decentralized governance.
Yeah, there's a really interesting sort of segueing from that. This idea of not having to take the data out of people's hands and just being able to verify it off, their personal data store or wallet or whatever, has been kicking around for quite a long time for lots of different application domains. But you still need some system to glue the whole thing together. And one version of federation is to take large systems and federate them, and that's something that we're working on directly. But the extreme version of federation is to take 10 billion small systems and federate them, and then provide some secure means of doing things with that. And then with some kind of opt-in, for example, other things in the Turing involve machine learning, where you can do federated learning across large numbers of systems, where you acquire models from people rather than their data, and then you aggregate the models. And yes, there are attacks on that can reverse from the models to the training data a bit. Most of them don't actually scale very well, but they exist. But you can fix those too with all kinds of peer-to-peer hierarchical and all kinds of other techniques. So one of the things about the decentralized kind of agenda, it's not a new thing. If you're, I used to work in an IP routing in 1980, which is quite some time ago, and that's decentralized, right? The internet routing infrastructure is decentralized, and ISPs are federated. internet service providers. So the core of the internet always was that way. Anyone running a computer could, in principle, turn that computer into a router just by having more than one interface. So mobile phone companies proved this was a threat quite early on when they stopped you doing it in most of the early operating systems on cell phones. So you couldn't simply tether a device via your phone to the internet, which is obviously idiotic. If you've got Bluetooth on one side and Wi-Fi on the other, why could you not do this? They actually turned off in iOS, most of the operating systems by default, since Berkeley released the first TCP/IP stack, would become a router if you had two interfaces. So they had to actually disable that functionality. But that was a decentralized world. Of course, since about 2000, we've had these business models that have arrived about monetizing your data, which basically involve taking your data and giving you a free service, but actually you're massively disadvantaged in the asymmetry of that world because the organizations that do it are a small number of very large cloud providers, and they have re-centralized the internet, which was the entire purpose of the internet was an end run, or at least outside of military, it was an end run on centralized organizations like phone companies to create something that was massively democratized and highly available and sustainable. That availability was part of the military goal, but it was a civilian goal too, and sustainable because you didn't have to have large servers. So we've gone backwards in the last 20 years, which is a big mistake. In the ID space, one of the observations I make was that some of the companies in this large cloud space have tried to own the identity ecosystem, and notably, not through any more than maximizing shareholder value. Microsoft tried to push their passport system, not the passport you go through borders with, but the piece of software they had, as a sort of unique sign-on for the world. Quite understandable. Well, of course, you do that if you had such a system, but of course, it's unacceptable. You couldn't have a monopoly system that was only a company that was, well, I would say US-based, but Microsoft's actually a registered Irish company in England as a tax avoidance strategy, again, driven just purely by normal business practices. That's not a good place to put a system for your national critical infrastructure, but it's also not sustainable because it's all centralized and you can have a single attack, reveal everyone's identity, and then everyone has to go through a revocation. And imagine the bottleneck inside a company like Microsoft trying to deal with 10 billion revocations and reissues. So there's a whole bunch of pieces that fit together here, and that decentralized story links with many other pieces. It has many motivations. We can have an offline argument about proof of stake and proof of work. That is a recent news thing with Ethereum switching, but let's not go into that as a detail. And there might be other solutions that somebody comes up with for providing some of those components. So as yet, it would be cool if there were. I think a couple of people, or most people, I think, here are aware of the incredible interdisciplinarity. So I was just trying to link up between these sort of policy, legal, regulatory, and technical. Do not separate in any tidy way. And if you unpick one, all the rest unravel. You have to think about them all the time. And part of this convening, bringing this meeting together, we hope to run the same thing next year, possibly in India. We were talking about possibly.
Maybe, maybe.
Is to convene people with all these different expertise so that we all get immersed in each other's way of talking about these things. And of course, there are other organizations doing the same thing so that we have some kind of rough consensus, which is another internet thing. I don't know if any people are aware, but the way internet standards work is you get in a room and people stand up and go, I think this is the way we should change TCP to do this thing better. And everyone goes, sounds okay. And if there's a bit of disagreement, we used to have a thing called a hum. If the room hums, that means they're in favor. They literally hum. It was pretty fun. And if you stood up and said, I'm from Cisco, everyone would go, so what? Right? This is very interesting, compared with, Google come along and say, we're going to do this way, and everyone has to comply. So all these pieces fit together. That might sound a bit political, but it's unavoidably political. And you have to consider all that. Everyone has to think about where their system will deploy. The very first talk today was talking a bit about deployment, and your system won't deploy if, as happened in some countries, notably Kenya, for example, you introduce a system, but people don't trust the organization, in that case the government, for that purpose. They might trust it for other purposes, might trust it for defense of the border or providing reliable roads or some other thing. But that particular thing was just something people didn't like. So you have to have something you can persuade people of those aspects are going to work. That's a trustworthiness word that Carsten emphasized right at the beginning. So I will shut up at that point. I could rabbit on forever about this.
We'll keep going back and forth.
Linking all those pieces is crucial. And effectively, as with any interdisciplinarity, it's a new interdisciplinarity of digital identity and trustworthy digital identity. We all need to learn the language and the languages, and we have to figure out how we understand the different moving parts. And we won't all have one solution either. That's not necessary. That's not how the world has to work. A single solution is almost certainly a very bad idea too. Okay.
I think that's a great point John made about interdisciplinary. I was thinking before I answered some questions, and I really believe and breathe interdisciplinarity. For those that know me, I've got lots of projects with lots of different universities, lots of different types. When we were looking at the NHS app, I still talk, John, sorry, about you and a great guy, some of you will know, Nigel Smart on Twitter. And Nigel saying, we must make sure this is private, the COVID contact tracing app. And John wrote back, I'm paraphrasing, but wrote back and said, no, saving lives is the important thing. And it was an interesting point because both feel passionate about privacy, actually, but it's about how you trade off those things. And the thing is, can we get enough information with it not being centralized or not? Where do we sit? What are people happy with? And around that, we did a survey at the Turing, a nationally representative survey, because I'd listened to this and I thought, nobody's asking people. We're saying we should do this, and Google's saying we should do that, and NCSC and government and everyone's saying it. And I thought, so we did a nationally representative survey where what we did is we presented different scenarios. We used a technique out of health economics called discrete choice experiments. It gives people different choices. They can choose A or B or consider them both the same. And you can elicit really interesting information. And the only reason I know that is because of this interdisciplinary work I do. And that was really useful in deciding, in determining what organizations do people trust. The responses from that was they didn't trust so much Google and Apple. And we know that in this country that's the case. But who did they trust? The NHS. Of course they do, because we love the NHS, right? So it was interesting about who they're willing to share data with. And that was an example of coming together and understanding different perspectives. And I was really pleased when Clara, you asked a question. It's great to have the interactive keynote. And, I fell back and I saw one of the answers at the end. I thought, why didn't I pick that? Because it was probably the top one. I skipped through it and looked at the others. And it was ask an AI ethicist. And it's interesting because I think, yeah, really, because I'm not an AI ethicist. I'm not an expert. But what I do know is I'd put things that I think are important. And it's important that we don't just have an AI ethicist, someone who works in ethics, just sitting there that you sort of consult now and again. They need to be embedded into the process. They need that conversation. You mentioned, John, about languages. We need to understand that people speak different languages. We will know the capabilities of technologies maybe better than an ethicist does. We will understand how some things can be compromised technologically, but we won't understand some of the ethics importance principles. So you need to have these experts, but really coming together around a common theme. And that interdisciplinarity is exactly the thing that brought that to mind. Around ethics, on ethics, where we talk about ethics, we talk about transparency, and fairness and explainability, all important things that we've seen Clara and others talk about today. And that is the thing about fairness. What is fair? Is it fair for everybody? Is it fair for underrepresented groups? How do we decide? But what we should be doing is making sure that under some guidance, the system in its whole serves those that it's intended to serve. And I think, Clara, you also asked about using data sets that were representative. And we're doing some work in this program right now around looking at biometrics, another thing that's come up a number of times today, to say, well, our biometric systems, we know there's faults with them. How much of the fault is the algorithm and how much is the fault of the training data? So you'll have seen Temnik Gebru done a lot of work in this area. You'll know that out of Maryland there's work going on. We've done some work ourselves which confirms on different sets about how poorly we can identify people. Talking about biometrics, there was the live facial recognition trials, and some of you will have been at the Royal Society or know about the Rider review that was released recently. But things are, if you're using biometrics, is it fair? Even though you say you can opt out, so there's a channel that you can go to, but you can walk around the side. Well, actually walking around the side might trigger some people to act differently if there's some law enforcement, for example. So is it really a good opt-out? Are you free of any suspicion? If you walk down that area, there was the case of the Ed Bridges who's with the South Wales Police, and the judge found on appeal in favour of some of the things, and what it was around was not being fair. And the reason was some of the arguments were like, oh, you're keeping my data, you're storing it because you're doing a comparison. Well, for such small amounts of a second, the judge didn't agree with that. And I agree with what the judge said there. But what they did say is that it should be fair across different groups. Why should you, if you are from a certain community or a certain gender, why should you be more likely to be stopped? Even if it's not on your record or something, you're going out to work. It's not fair that you should just be stopped and somebody else shouldn't. And these are things where biometric systems are important, and they're used in digital identity. Most of the time in digital identity, it's a one-to-one match, right? You say who you are. So that kind of thing doesn't happen. But once you've got the digital identity database, the biometric database, who knows what it can be used for later, right? So these are all really important questions that I think, we've really touched on in some ways today. As I've been talking, John has written about 100 words.
No.
So he's obviously got lots to say. So come on, John.
Just one more thing. We had a meeting here with the folks from we had a meeting quite recently with folks from MOSIP and IIT Bangalore. Some of whom are here. But this was a few weeks back. And one of the things we were talking about is how do you make a system that they happen to have one system, which is mostly, it doesn't matter what it is. How do you make a piece of code sustainable? How do you make it a digital public good? It was a more general question. Digital public goods are a really cool idea. And one of the things you want to go with code is test data, but also one of the things you want to go with code is a governance model. Is how does that thing go on being sustained? So, for example, when DARPA funded University of California, Berkeley to do the first TCP/IP implementation back about 1980 for Unix, they bizarrely made it a requirement that Berkeley open source that, actually open source it with a Berkeley license, which meant that people could then make money from it, as opposed to the MIT GPL license, which is a very interesting step. But that made it actually sustain. In fact, if you're into Internet Protocol standards, after 40 years, they've just written an update to the TCP standard, which is pretty amazing. I mean, there've been lots of add-on options, but they're just increments, whereas they just literally updated. So that's quite sustainable. And there's code out there. If you've got a Apple device, it's almost certainly got code that I wrote part of back in 1983. That's part of the TCP stack, that's still in there because it works. So, and why would you throw away working code? And then people have rewritten that for Linux and rewritten it for Windows, a completely different stack, and so on and so on. But that idea of how do you build a sustainable ecosystem for ID is very interesting. I was at a meeting the last 2 days, previous 2 days at BBC and Royal Society. We were talking about how do you build provenance, tracking of facts through all the different agencies delivering news to people. How would you tell that something's been fact-checked? Who's it been fact-checked by? Has it been modified en route? Has it got integrity and so on? And the BBC is super interested in making, because they're a public broadcaster, they were interested in having an open ecosystem supports that. And we would like to do something similar with ID systems. I think, most of it is open source. There are other people who can do open source. The thing that Tim described as open source, it's not just that it's open source. You have to have these other pieces. Test data, you heard about synthetic data, but you might want to have real data, but you need to have it protected in some very, very careful way so you don't reveal stuff about ID or use of ID and verification and so on. And you'd like to have associated maybe multiple governance models that go with this. How is this? And a governance model could be implicit. It could be that the code has a BSD license or a GPL on it. That's okay. Or it could be much more complicated. You could have many other things about, for example, how are contributors enlisted? Are they rewarded in any way? People might remember when Red Hat IPO'd, for example. It was kind of interesting step function. But you could have many other models. We haven't even scratched the surface in formalizing all that. Again, just to illustrate, it's such an interdisciplinary space for how you might make these systems have the properties we want in terms of the ethics, there's fairness and so on, but also, to keep that way and not suddenly move off in some right or left-hand turn into something we don't like, which is what centralized cloud did to some things. not all bad. Some of it's very good, but it's did do some scalability things that are hard to do in decentralized world. But anyway, so that's another thing, and we're having this ongoing conversation, and people are interested in this notion of digital public goods, which is not the store of your digital ID. It is the system and how you make that work and go on working. So that's enough for me again.
Right. Yeah. So there is a digital public goods alliance looking at the kind of open source technologies for government interaction. And yeah, I think it's very important, John. So a really good point. One of the things that we're going to release as a digital public good at some point is our framework for measuring the trustworthiness. So around those 6 facets of security, of privacy, of ethics, reliability, robustness, and resilience, about how do we measure that. And we've looked at so many standards that there are, and John's been involved in the standards world for a long time. Tim was mentioning W3C, but there's a whole load of standards that sort of govern or recommend, provide guidance around this space that we're drawing together on, but trying to give something that we can give ways that people can measure how fair a system might be, for example. And then using that, we can then put beneath that the tools that can help support that. And that's not just tools that we're writing, but the whole community. We've seen people today where they've talked about techniques for MOSIP, for example. So yeah, we continue to work on that, and we'll hope to engage you with that. And talking about engagement, we do have our interest group. It's something I'm very proud of. Chris at the back co-chairs the Trustworthy Digital Identity Interest Group with me. And it's a real interest group that really has conversations. We always have a great speaker. We've had people from all around the world, but it encourages, people join from New Zealand, from Australia, from India, Chile, Brazil, west coast of US, Vancouver, so on, so all at the same time. And you think that's global coverage, right, all across the UK. And they do it because it's interesting. It's not just a seminar. It's not just someone promoting their latest research or someone promoting their latest product or service. It's about what is going on in the world of ID for at least 10 minutes, then a presentation that stimulates some idea and a discussion afterwards. So if you're not part of that interest group, please do consider it. We've enjoyed your contributions today. I've got a number of thanks I'd like to say to all the speakers for really stimulating discussions today. And we've seen every time we try to get back to the next session, it's the conversations that have been so rich that have made that challenging for us to stay on time. And we're pretty close. We're only a couple of minutes over at the moment. But also, it's meant that when we were talking, we'd have to cut off and say, let's talk later and take that offline. So thank you to all of the speakers, and including those that gave the posters, which will all be online. So some of us didn't see all the poster videos because we were having lunch. But thank you to those that provided that. Thanks to those that submitted and were not selected. As I say, it wasn't because the work wasn't of good, high quality, but we've got limited space. And what we wanted to do is ensure we had the right coverage. I'd like to thank the audience. There were some fantastic questions there, many more than we had time to answer. And that includes questions that came from online participants. Sometimes you can't see because it says anonymous, but some of the names that I saw were definitely online. So thank you to all of those. I'd like to thank the great organizational skills of the team here. So Chiara, Amber, Angelica, Shane's been helping out, and Mark I know as well, and all the people that have contributed. I'm sorry if I've missed anyone out. I know Tash and Kate have more recently I've got to meet and done a fantastic job, and great audio visual support when we're struggling earlier on. So thank you very much. I'm really, really grateful to you, genuinely grateful, because it's made it such a great event, and I know how much hard work it is. So and it's one of the things that makes me think how proud I am to be part of this institute. And I hope you've enjoyed being with us today on this. It's a fantastic place. It really is inspirational. It's not exclusive. This event was open to people. We've had people, as I say, come from many places around the world. And it's just really great to be in this hybrid state after such a difficult couple of years. And we're just starting to do more of that. So thank you to everybody. We're now going to draw a close to the proceedings. For those of you that are here, we can have some coffee outside and we'll probably stay for around half an hour. For those at home, feel free to make yourselves a coffee, whatever you like. Depending on the time of day, it might be gin o'clock for you already. We will then be going for some networking just across the road to the German gymnasium. So for those that are here, please do join us over there where we can carry on the conversation. Anything else to add, John? And thanks finally to my people who organised the sessions and chaired the sessions, because we don't get to thank them as we're going along. So thanks, John, Mark, and Lydia. So, okay, thank you. Let's close it.